The views and opinions expressed on this program are those of the participants and do not reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
BronxNet. Your voice, your views, your vision.
Good evening and welcome to Bronx Talk. 10 days ago, the New York State Legislature concluded its session with a mixed bag of results. We're going to review the whole package tonight with a Bronx representative from the Assembly and one from the Senate. And that includes discussion on women's rights, gun control, anti-corruption legislation, the budget, and more. Please join in the dialogue by calling in. You can talk to two of your state representatives if you call in at 718-960-7241, or you can email questions or comments to us at BronxTalk@hotmail.com, and we'll read those on the air during a future edition of our program. For now, it's the senator from the 33rd District in the Bronx, Senator Gustavo Rivera. Good evening, sir. Welcome back.
Good evening. Happy to be here.
And thank you. And from the 81st Assembly District, it's Jeffrey Dinowitz. Welcome back to the program.
Great to be here.
Nice to have you both with us. Senator, we'll start with you, and we'll let the Assemblyman weigh in on the same question to get us going. The women's empowerment legislation failed. The anti-corruption legislation failed. And there was new gun legislation that actually was a step back from the historic advancements that the state had made. We'll talk about the specifics of that legislation in a moment. But they used to talk about 3 men in a room in Albany. After this last session, it seems to have morphed into a battle in the Senate of the top Republicans and independent Democratic conference who call the shots. Is this, again, an indication that Albany is still broken, or are we better off than the systems that we've had in the past?
We're not better off. And I think ultimately this Republican-led coalition in the Senate, ultimately what we need to talk about is what it produced. As they say, the proof is in the pudding. And when we talk about what happened during the session, certainly we got the SAFE Act done, but I believe that was at the beginning of session, right when the tragedy at Sandy Hook was so fresh in our memories, and I was very glad, I was very proud to be able to be supportive of that package. But then you look at the rest of the legislative session, there was no DREAM Act, there was no campaign finance reform, no women's equality agenda. You had a very bad deal on minimum wage. There were a lot of disappointments. So ultimately, I believe that we have to see what actually happened, what the Republican-led coalition produced in the Senate, and I think that it did not produce many good things.
Is this a systematic problem, a systemic problem, or just an indication that, well, you know, they have the majority and you don't happen to agree with what they've turned out?
Well, I think it's part of the results. I believe that when this Republican-led coalition announced that it was forming, this unprecedented arrangement in state government, they announced the reasoning for this arrangement was to produce progressive legislation. You could go back and look at the statements that they made then. So I will just say that at the end, once you say you're going to do something, then I'm going to ask you at the end of the process whether you got it done or not. And I think that the results, unfortunately, speak for themselves.
Would you simply say then, well, this independent caucus is a problem? Of course, the numbers would show if they would vote with Democrats, certainly you could get some of that legislation. Is that where the problem is?
The problem is that when you have a Republican-led coalition, you have, because remember, you have 4 independent Democrats, but you have 27 Republican senators. And what happened is on a lot of issues, just on women's equality alone, when you're talking about that last point that had to do with women's choice, they had basically veto power over whether it was going to be considered on the floor.
This is why I said it's not the 3 men in the room. It's really that dynamic is what controls the agenda for essentially the entire state of New York. Right? Is that accurate?
What I would say is that when we're looking at the current arrangement in the state Senate, this Republican-led coalition, unfortunately, did not produce the results that it claimed it was going to produce. So I would simply stick to saying, we look at the results, or the lack thereof, and judge it accordingly. And if we do that, we will see, in my opinion, that this was, unfortunately, a very disappointing session.
Much more unanimity in the Assembly on issues. Do you point your finger or have concern in that direction, or is there something in the House of the Assembly that you want to take a look at and say, gee, our systems are not working?
No, the Assembly did great. There are many people responsible for what happened and for what did not happen this year. We did get some good things done, but frankly, I thought it was a big disappointment. Toward the end, the Women's Equality Act, for example, was front and center. The Assembly passed a bill which had 10 points. These are the 10 points that the governor proposed. These are pieces of legislation that the Assembly individually has passed time and time again. For example, the human trafficking, sexual harassment, a whole slew of issues that relate to women's equality. And the 10 points, they were somewhat watered down by the time the governor submitted this bill, which she didn't do until a couple of weeks before the end of the legislative session. But we passed it in the Assembly, and we had a lot of Republicans get up and say, oh, well, I would vote for 9 points, but I just can't vote for the 10th piece, which deals with reproductive rights. And the fact is, most of those Republicans who said they would vote for 9 points, when they had the chance to vote on some of those points individually, didn't. They're against pay equity, for example, and a whole bunch of other good things that were in that bill. So it's very easy for them to say that they were for the other 9 points, but I have a funny feeling if they were given the opportunity to vote on a 9-point agenda, they would have voted no as well in the Assembly.
Do you then point, much similar to what the senator does, take a look at what's going on in the Senate and say, you know what, that's really where the stumbling block is to get legislation passed?
Well, I think in part it's correct. Unfortunately, and I think some of the votes in the Senate bear it out. I'm not sure that there are 32 votes. Tell me if you disagree. I'm not sure there were 32 votes in the Senate to pass the piece concerning women's reproductive rights, for example, because 2 of the registered Democrats, one of them is from the Bronx, and the other actually caucuses or conferences with the Republicans. He's from Brooklyn. They voted no on that. And
so you think you might not have had that anyway?
I don't know. I don't think we would have.
Know,
I think one thing is clear. We need to elect more Democrats in the state Senate. You know, when you think of the fact that 2/3 or more of the Assembly is Democratic, and that kind of reflects the political alignment within the state. It's not the case in the Senate through no fault of anybody other than the people who drew the lines, but I think over time that's going to change because the demographics are what they are, and Republicans, to tell you the truth, I think they're a dying breed over the long term.
That's a statement that others can debate. We won't debate that right now. But
I will agree with that statement,
I'm
by the
sure
way.
you would. Let's talk about how the women's rights legislation. You talked about the 9 points. One of the ones, pay equity, was in there. I mean, there were many very interesting possibilities in there. Was it right for the Assembly to say, well, we're not going to compromise, and the reproductive rights legislation has to be in there, and you have to take it all at once? Or would you be better off right now to say, you know what, all right, we're not getting that. You've acknowledged that the numbers don't add up in any case, possibly in the Senate. Maybe we should back off that 10th point, pass the 9 points, and then move on and debate reproductive rights in the future.
That's always a dilemma you face, whether to go for the whole thing or go for a compromise, knowing that once you do that, it kind of takes the wind out of the sails of getting the rest of it done in the future. We passed the 10-point agenda. The day we passed it, every women's group in the state stood with us, stood with the Speaker of the Assembly, praised us for passing that 10-point agenda. And then in the Senate, the Republicans basically passed 9 individual points.
Would you rather have said, you know what, I would much rather have not all, but I would rather have those 9 points, even if I didn't get this one.
I don't regret what we did. I think we did the right thing. We passed the 10-point package. It was the correct thing to do. We do have the opportunity in the future to reconsider whether or not we want to, let it be the way it is or pass 9 points. But we did the right thing at the time.
Senator, your thought?
I will absolutely add my 10 cents here, if you will, to the 10th point.
They're not measuring the money on
That's
it.
right. The fact of the matter is that when we're talking about equality for women in the state of New York, whether we're talking about pay equity, we're talking about sexual harassment, we're talking about human trafficking, the fact of the matter is that as it relates to the reproductive choice of women of this state, that is just as important, if not more important, than the rest of them. We have something that is basic, that has been, and all that we're talking about, by the way, there was a lot of misinformation about this piece of legislation over the last couple of years, because our leader, Andrea Stewart-Cousins, introduced this piece of legislation, the 10th point, if you will, was part of a legislation that she introduced all the way back in 2007 when she started serving in the Senate. I was her chief of staff at the time. So ultimately, women's reproductive choice is just as important as the rest of them, and we need to make sure that it was included in there.
Assemblyman, back to you. It's obvious that Shelley Silver's leadership is being questioned, and certainly his handling of the Vito Lopez case is questioned as well. Isn't it somewhat hypocritical of him to be fighting on women's rights when right now women's groups are looking at him and saying, you know what, Mr. Speaker, you're exactly the kind of person who we really don't want to have running things, because you have compromised the integrity of fighting for women in what happened in the Assembly in the Vito Lopez case.
Every leader of the Women's Coalition stood with the Speaker and praised him as being the #1 person over time, and including up until the day that legislation was passed in the Assembly, who has stood for women's equality, who has been in the forefront. He has been the #1 leader, not only in that, but in terms of almost every piece of progressive legislation in this state. Did he make a mistake last year when he allowed that settlement to take place? Yes, he did make a mistake. He admitted he made the mistake. He put new rules into place to make sure.
Well, he said he was going to, as I understood it, he said he was going to put new rules into place, but we didn't get those rules.
No, he did put new rules into place within the Assembly. What did not happen was legislation did not pass, and that too can happen. But I think that we all know that editorial boards, which have been calling on him to resign, always wanted him to resign before any of this stuff happened.
Well, but now that it happened, maybe... let me ask you this. Is his leadership, the fact that it's being questioned so heavily, and there's no doubt you admitted that he made a mistake, is it maybe time now for him to say, you know what, I'm not helping this body of, that I have led all this time. It may be time for me to step down, get a new, vibrant young leader in there to move the state assembly ahead?
I think he has done an incredible job as leader, and I believe the members of the Democratic Conference are 100% behind him. The only two members of the conference who don't support him are the same two people who voted against him being leader at the beginning of this year. So he has the solid support of the constituency that chooses the Speaker, which is the Democratic majority. And if he wasn't a progressive Democrat, if he wasn't a person who, through the lean years when Governor Pataki was governor, for example, didn't make things happen, then he wouldn't have that support. But he has made things happen on rent laws, on minimum wage, on a lot of things. Is he a person of
integrity on women's rights and women's issues?
I think so. Let's not lose sight of the fact that he's not the one who was accused of the misconduct. It was Assemblyman or former Assemblyman Vito Lopez.
He was an enabler in some ways by not saying, drawing the line and not.
Well, you know what, and this, I'm not sure that it's been settled yet, but these kind of settlements, and I don't particularly like them myself, but these are very typical of what takes place both in the public sector and in the private sector. Mm-hmm. Agreements, lawsuits that are settled, but they're settled quietly, and there's a non-disclosure requirement. This happens all the time. Should it happen in the state legislature? That can be argued that it shouldn't. I don't think it should have happened, but it does happen, and this is an opportunity for people who've always been his opponent to try to have his head.
Let's say hello to Mark from Pelham Park. It's been a little while, Mark. You used to call all the time, but no matter.
Gary.
I'm happy to have you tonight.
Hey, Gary, I think what I'm starting to hear is we're going to start drinking Kool-Aid, and I'm going to be in Jim Jones land here.
What's your question?
I think everybody is becoming self-delusional. One, you're right, these deals are always made, but they're not made with public money. When we're cutting teachers and classes and everything and education budgets. Two, when you hush a deal like that and try and cover it up, you're protecting the very fiend that is out there, that if it was anybody like me or Gary, they'd be parading us out and we'd be in cuffs in jail. Number two, I think the problem is not more Democrats or more Republicans. I think it's term limits. I think all you guys just sit there way too long, and you sit comfortably in the seats, and they take the form of your rear end.
Senator Rivera hasn't been there too long, that long.
If you want to make change, you need new blood.
All right. Thank you very much. Term limits, I'm assuming you don't like the idea in the Assembly? Or
Well, we
in the state
don't have
legislature?
term limits in
I
the
know.
legislature. And you know, for the people who call for term limits, has the city council, I'm not here to criticize the city council, but have they been better or worse because of term limits?
Let me ask you.
I don't think Larry Seabrook or the councilman from Queens who's under indictment, or Councilman Martinez who is in jail, are prime examples of how term limits
I don't want to spend a lot
here.
of time on this because I really do want to talk about a number of other state issues. But aren't we better off in the Bronx, and you both can weigh in for the fact that this summer I'm going to do 6 debates. We're going to bring in new people. People are going to get a chance to be invigorated by the process, that maybe they can elect somebody who is more effective in their district. That's not a good thing?
Or less effective, depending upon the district and depending upon the candidates. Term limits could work or it could not work. But merely getting rid of somebody who the voters may want doesn't necessarily make things better. It's an easy answer for people who like to complain.
Senator, your thoughts on term limits? Actually, it leads right into the question about, do we need public financing in state campaigns? And I know you put forward the idea of using the lever machines again. So let's talk about the whole voting process.
Well, one thing at a time. First, on the issue, because there's many questions that you just kind of
I
asked.
realize that.
As far as term limits are concerned, I do think that term limits for the executive are certainly warranted. I think that there's an open discussion about how effective they are for a legislature. And ultimately, I believe that we need to make the process more accessible so that people have more participation, which brings us right to campaign finance reform and to just changing the electoral system and making it more accessible. The bill that you're referring to that had to do with lever machines was one that I injected a hostile amendment to. And the hostile amendment was to create a campaign finance reform system, which would, among other things, provide full public financing of campaigns and more access and a more democratic system. Now, there's an argument, and we can have a whole show about this, but very briefly, I believe that a democratic system should have as much access as possible. We should have more access from people like myself, who are not independently wealthy, who should be candidates, and who, if I didn't have the situation that I had when I ran against that guy whose name I can't remember, I would not have been able to raise the $400,000 that was necessary for me to be able to
You're
beat
saying
him.
because the upheaval against him was so strong.
Correct.
And you would not have been able to do
I was not. The fact of the matter is that if I had to, when I ran for office, I raised about $400,000, and on the day of the election, I was $90,000 in the hole. So I was actually in the red even before I got elected. Now, the fact that I almost had to raise $500,000 for a state Senate seat, who can actually raise that sort of money? So the point that I'm making here is that we should have a system that is more democratic and more accessible to the voters, more accessible to candidates, more accessible to everybody.
The governor wanted to make it a crime for lawmakers a crime for them to not report attempted bribes. That seems to me, in the framework that we're working on right now, where Assemblyman just mentioned, elected officials who've gone to jail. Your predecessor, Senator Espada,
that's his name.
Espada?
We were talking
That name
about.
rings a bell.
In this climate, isn't that just a given? And wouldn't all elected officials, regardless of party, want to get behind something like that and say, you know what, no, we don't want our institution to be sullied? Why didn't this pass?
I don't believe that it was actually introduced as a piece of legislation.
He
I didn't see it.
proposed a
He
bill.
didn't propose it. Well,
No.
it had been
and,
out
and you
there.
know what? Just to make the record clear, when we're talking about corruption in politics, and that's always been with us, and perhaps it always will be, hopefully not, it's not just in the legislative branch. There's corruption in the executive branch of government. How many governors resigned in the past several years? How many state controllers were forced out of office? It's a problem in elective office and in appointive office. But most people are not like that. And yes, if somebody in office knows about a crime, of course they should report it. Of course they should report it.
Would you support legislation like that?
I absolutely, but I don't really think you need legislation
You
to do
shouldn't
that.
need
'Cause
legislation.
I'm pretty sure that we're required to report crimes anyway without there being additional legislation. So it's easy to make proposals like that, but the fact is, honest people are going to do the right thing. Dishonest people aren't. I'm a co-sponsor of the legislation that Senator Rivera was just talking about, which includes public financing and other reforms. Very important. But the truth is, if somebody's a crook, they're going to find a way to be a crook. It's like the ethics reporting. We have to disclose a lot about our personal information, about our income.
I don't believe enough, personally. That
I wish I had more to disclose, frankly. But the point is that somebody who's a crook is going to still be a crook and is going to still lie on those forms.
And
perhaps.
one thing, Gary, that I would add to that is that you have, I believe that the most important thing that we can do to get corruption out of politics is to get money out of politics, which means we need public financing of campaigns. If I have to have a conversation with a union or a lobbyist, I would want to have that conversation strictly about the issues that impact their membership or the issues that impact.
As opposed to that you would conform your concepts because you want to get a donation.
I mean, the fact of the matter is that we still have to raise money to be able to run effective campaigns.
Let's go to the telephone. Adam from Pelham Gardens is joining us. Adam, thank you for calling in. How are you?
I'm okay. How you doing, Gary?
Just fine, thank you.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, I want to congratulate you for picking two fantastic, guests who I feel, exemplify some of the better folks we have in Albany.
Okay.
So you stole my question on Shelley Silver. I think you did a great job on putting that out there.
What question do you have?
As you were bringing up term limits a few minutes ago, it made me think about the issue of seniority, and I feel like that's sort of one of the big things that makes the legislature so much different from the council, insofar as having a long time in the body. It enables you to have more power. So what I wanted to ask both the senator and the assemblyman,
what's your question about that?
One who's been in Albany for a while, one who has only been for a few years, how they feel about that specifically, how seniority plays a role in committee chairmanships and that sort of thing, and how that would affect something like term limits.
Since you're a relatively new Senator, what's your thought?
What's a little bit different in the Senate than the Assembly. In the case of the Senate, if we were in the majority today, I would be the chair of the Health Committee today, having only been in the Senate for a few years. But I do believe that someone that has seniority not only has that, but also has experience. If you have, right now, as I said, I'm the ranking member in the Health Committee in the Senate, and the health field is incredibly complicated. A lot of complexities involved in making decisions about the healthcare delivery system in the state of New York. The person that is currently in the State Assembly, who's the chair of that committee, Richard Gottfried, has been in that seat for longer than I have been alive, and has been in the chairmanship of the Health Committee for longer than 20 years. Now you have somebody who knows more about healthcare policy than anybody else. So I think that there is value to having somebody who's more experienced and being able to determine policy.
Bob from Riverdale just called up, and we're going to fit Bob in on the show because we always like that when he calls. I think that's who it is. Hi, Bob.
How are you, Gary? How are you, gentlemen?
It's Bob Press.
What's up, Bob?
Rarely hear from that gentleman.
Assemblyman Dinowitz, on New York City term limits. You supported Councilman Oliver Coppell in 2001 when June Eisman was term limited out, and now you support Andy Cohen in 2013 when Coppell is term limited out. If you want to stop term limits, there was an option for the State Assembly and the State Senate to change the term limit law in New York City this year. That probably would have passed the State Senate, as Senator Gustavo will probably tell you, because they were outnumbered, the Democrats. So why did someone like you, Assemblyman Dinowitz, not sponsor the bill to change term limits in the State Assembly?
All right.
Well, the answer is pretty straightforward. I don't believe the state legislature ought to be dictating to the city of New York its rules with respect to term limits. I think the original term limit vote back when was purchased by a billionaire. I think there was public support for it, but a billionaire, Ron Lauder, financed the entire campaign. That's one of the problems with having a referendum like that. And then when it was renewed, or when it was, I guess, re-ratified, once again, he financed the entire operation. I don't particularly care for how the city council and the mayor changed it, but I don't believe that term limits serve us well, and it shouldn't have been there. June Eisman was an excellent councilwoman. Oliver Coppell's been excellent. I know Andy Cohen will be an excellent councilman. But I think the voters ought to be given the opportunity to elect whomever they want and not have people eliminated because of an artificial rule by people who who have billions of dollars to spend.
And then creating a system whereby anybody that is a good candidate can get access to money by just convincing enough people in their district to give them $10 or $20, and then having that be matched on a 5-to-1 or 6-to-1 basis, and have them be able to have the resources to be able to communicate how good they would be representing that district.
Senator, we're almost out of time, but I promised you we'd get a chance to talk about the Vet Connect bill.
Yes.
Why don't we talk about it? I know you're proud of it, and the
We
Assemblyman was part of that.
Yes, well, the Assembly member is the co-sponsor in the Assembly. It is unfortunate that it didn't pass yet, but who knows, maybe they'll be back at some point this year, maybe it'll pass. But
maybe next year.
Or maybe next year, but certainly Vets Connect, what it does is it provides access to veterans. There is a recent study that found that 59% of veterans might not even know that they have access to services, that they can have access to services if they were merely, the Veterans Administration knew where they were and who they were. So this would do is if you are in the DMV and you're renewing a license, there would be a box that you would just mark as a veteran, so then your information could be shared with the Veterans Administration, and then they would have access to services.
Didn't pass this time, you're hopeful in the future.
It passed in the Senate. It didnn't pass in the Assembly yet, but he's going to work on it.
If you get my bills passed, I'll get your bills passed.
Got about 30 seconds.
Deal?
30 seconds, Assemblyman. Were you disappointed about the backing off of on gun control? I know you've been an ardent supporter of gun control, allowing retired law enforcement officers to keep their weapons. Is this a big deal?
I don't know if it's a big deal. I think the bigger deal was what we passed in January in the first place, which, frankly, I would have loved to have seen be a stronger piece of legislation than what we actually did pass. So we have more work to do in the future.
Senator Gustavo Rivera, Assemblyman Jeffrey Dinowitz, always great to have you, and we hope you'll come back again.
Yes, sir.
Folks, we received these comments after last week's show, which included discussion on the prospects for a soccer stadium in the Bronx. We got a message on our Facebook page that said, sports complexes and luxury shopping malls in a borough that is one of the poorest in the country? ? Give this borough brain power. Brooklyn is becoming the next Silicon Valley. Why not the great borough of the Bronx? That came from Harding Park, Bronx on Facebook. And the other comment we received on the same subject, a soccer field is what they should have done with the Kingsbridge Armory. Sure, they could have had a couple of ice rinks, but 9, a bit of overkill. And that came from Christina on Facebook. If you have further comments or questions on anything you heard on tonight's show or anything going on in the Bronx, then email them to us at bronxtalk@hotmail.com, or make a comment like those folks did on our Facebook page, and we'll read those on the air during a future edition of our program. Archives of Bronx Talk are available at bronxnet.org. You'll click Bronx Talk on the right-hand navigation bar. Also, please become a fan of Bronx Talk on Facebook. Next Monday night, mayoral candidate John Catsimatidis will join us. And on July 29, we'll start an unprecedented weekly series of political debates that will run all the way through August, right up to primary day. So we'll see you next week. Good night.
How you doing?
Hi.
Hi. Have a nice day.
You too.
Thanks.
If only child abuse were this easy to recognize. If you even suspect abuse, call 1-800